Noam, if we could sort of start by discussing Iraq. As you said in the concluding parts of your speech, even the elections which are taking place in a very limited way might produce a government which could demand that the United States leaves Iraq. Traditionally, the United States, unlike the European empires, has preferred to rule indirectly. They don't like being present. They send the Marines in when they have to, but they prefer to rule countries through local relays who do the dirty work themselves. So, I mean, Iraq is a very complex situation, but theoretically, there is nothing to stop them from withdrawing the troops if they are convinced that the government there is going to do their bidding.
Well, if they're convinced of that,
yeah.
But how can they be convinced? In fact, well, I don't have to tell you, let's just imagine what the policies might be of an independent Iraq, independent sovereign Iraq, let's say more or less democratic. What are the policies likely to be? Well, there's going to be a Shiite majority, so they'll have some significant influence over policy. The first thing they'll do is reestablish relations with Iran. Now, they don't particularly like Iran, but they don't want to go to war with them. So they'll move towards what was happening already, even under Saddam, restoring some sorts of friendly relations with Iran. Well, that's the last thing the United States wants. It's worked very hard to try to isolate Iran. The next thing that might happen is a Shiite-controlled, more or less democratic Iraq might stir up feelings in the Shiite areas of Saudi Arabia, which happen to be right nearby, and which happen to be where all the oil is. So you might find what in Washington must be the ultimate nightmare, a Shiite region which controls most of the world's oil and is independent. Furthermore, an independent Iraq is very likely. You know more about it than me, so I'm interested in hearing what you think. But my guess is that an independent sovereign Iraq would try to take its natural place as a leading state in the Arab world, maybe the leading state. And, that's something that goes back to biblical times. What does that mean? Well, it means rearming, first of all. They have to confront the regional enemy. The regional enemy, overpowering enemy, is Israel. They're going to have to rearm to confront Israel, which means probably developing weapons of mass destruction, just as a deterrent. So here's the picture of what they must be dreaming about in Washington, and probably 10 Downing Street, I don't know who does the thinking there, that here you might get a region, sovereign, independent, substantial Shiite majority, including most of the world's energy, rearming, developing weapons of mass destruction, to try to get rid of the U.S. outposts that are there to ensure that the United States controls the oil reserves of the world. I mean, is Washington going to sit there and allow that? That's kind of next to inconceivable.
I think that this is a big problem.
It is.
Massive problem for the United States, that this entire rhetoric about democracy could implode in their face. Because if you haven't, which is why something tells me that these elections are going to be rigged. I'm referring to the Iraqi elections. That they will, the way they're setting up the voting pattern, that lots of Iraqi exiles in Britain and Europe can vote, it's unheard of, actually. The way they're setting up the elections inside Iraq itself in some areas is very dubious. The model they have is the elections in Afghanistan, which were a total fraud. And the reason they're doing it is to make sure some of their hardcore people come into the new assembly. But despite that, I think you're right, Noam, that despite all the chicanery, they might still have a government which A, wants them out, and I cannot see even a weak Iraqi government, dependent on occupation troops, agreeing to allow Iraqi oil to be controlled by non-Iraqis. So Iraqi control of Iraqi oil, no foreign troops in Iraq, could become the big demand, which means that the war will go on.
Yeah, if they agree to that. But I think what I just read from the business press in the last couple of days probably reflects the thinking in Washington and London. Well, okay, we'll let them have a government, but we're not going to pay any attention to what they say. Yeah. In fact, the Pentagon announced at the same time, 2 days ago, we're keeping 120,000 troops there into at least 2007, even if they call for withdrawal tomorrow. And the propaganda is very evident right in these articles. You can write the articles now, the commentary. We just have to do it because we have to accomplish our mission of bringing democracy to Iraq. And if they have an elected government that doesn't understand that, well, you know, what can we do with these dumb Arabs? You know, actually, that's very common. Look, after all, the U.S. has overthrown democracy after democracy because the people don't understand. They follow the wrong course. So therefore, following the mission of establishing democracy, we've got to overthrow their governments.
The thing is, if they're thinking seriously, they should be thinking that if they do that and make the government, you know, even elected in these weird circumstances, totally useless, the people who've elected it could begin to move towards joining the armed resistance groups in Iraq. That's a big danger for the United States.
But remember, these guys have a lot of experience. The same Thomas Carruthers, who's interesting. He's the smartest of the lot, and there are a lot of them now. He points out, he's a great believer in what he calls Reaganite programs of enhancing democracy. In fact, he participated in them. He was in the State Department in the Reagan years in the democracy promotion projects. And he's written the main scholarly books and articles on what happened, and it's pretty frank. He doesn't seem to understand what he's saying, just as in what I quoted, but it's frank. I mean, he says the Reagan programs were, of course, noble and inspiration, but they were a failure, and a very systematic failure. Namely, he points out in the southern cone of the hemisphere, where the United States had very little influence, there was real progress towards democracy, which the Reagan administration tried to stop, but couldn't stop, and therefore reluctantly accepted it. In the regions where the U.S. has the greatest influence, nearby, there was the least progress towards democracy. And even that, he says, was constrained by the fact that the U.S. would only accept top-down forms of democracy in which traditional elites allied to the United States remain in power. But that's a noble vision. That's a wonderful program. We're bringing democracy. And these appear, he's regarded as a liberal commentator, like he appears in Dissent, for example. And this is taken serious. I'm sure people who read these articles that I just quoted didn't laugh, although I don't exactly know how. And there's a long history of it, just as there's a history of projecting the United States as a model of democracy when it's almost a prototypical example of a failed state, a state with democratic forms but no functioning.
I mean, just carrying on those lines, let's assume that the situation gets worse. Large groups in the south begin to join the resistance. That will require more troops from the United States to try and control the resistance inside Iraq. Given that we have this strange situation in the United States that the reserves are drying up, that fewer and fewer people are volunteering to join the army, more are volunteering to join the Navy and the Air Force because they're safer. Could this push the government to introducing conscription?
Could, but I suspect, my guess is, I think that's going to be a last resort. And the reason is the Vietnam experience.
Yeah.
The Vietnam experience, I think, is the first time in the history of European imperialism that an imperial power tried to fight a colonial war with a citizen's army.
Yeah.
I mean, the British didn't do it.
Never.
They fought with Gurkhas and sepoys and so on.
Yeah.
The French had the Foreign Legion. Colonial wars, civilians just are no good at. I mean, they're too brutal and vicious and murderous. You just can't take kids off the street and have them fight that kind of a war. You need trained killers, like the French Foreign Legion. And in fact, you could see it happening in Vietnam. To its credit, the army fell apart after a couple of, it took too long, but finally the army essentially fell apart. Soldiers were on drugs, they were fragging officers, not following orders, and so on. And the top brass wanted them out. You look back at the military journals in the late 60s, they were writing about how we got to get this army out of here. The army's going to collapse. Pretty much like the head of the reserve said 2 or 3 days ago. He said, this is becoming a broken force. You know, people can't do it. Well, they dropped conscription at that point and shifted to what's called a volunteer army, which in effect means a mercenary army of the disadvantaged. So army recruiters don't go to the high schools and colleges in the suburbs. They go down to the poor areas and try to offer inducements to poor, disadvantaged people to go into the services. And that way you do get a kind of a mercenary army. But even that is limited. I mean, you really need professional killers. And I suspect that's the reason why they're bringing in so many of the, you know, what do they call them? The MPRI and DynCorp, you know, the contractors, the military contractors. Yes. You kind of privatize it to trained killers, you know, like South African mercenaries or the, you know, ex-officers in DynCorp. And then you get people who can do that kind of thing. Actually, I think by now the second largest contingent in Iraq, greater than the British, is the contractors, which means basically trained killers, you know. But do they have enough of them?
I don't think they have enough of them, and there are not that many countries which will like to supply them either now. And the British army is in a mess, and a number of leading British generals have said, if the local population turns against us, one colonel actually said it on television. He said, if there is a large demonstration of 200,000 Shia people outside our barracks, I'm not going to give the orders to open fire. I think that'll be time to come back home. So whether or not Blair wants it, there could be rebellions inside his army. As you know, it's quite incredible.
I don't know about you, but I've been extremely surprised by what's happened since the invasion. My own guess at the time was that the invasion would take about 2 days. Iraq was a broken country, very scarcely held together with Scotch tape. If that hadn't been true, they would never have invaded. They knew it. And I thought it would be the easiest military occupation in history. You know, here the country had been practically wiped out by sanctions, killed hundreds of thousands of people. It was barely being held together. I mean, here, you know, people talk about how glad they were to get rid of Saddam Hussein. I presume they were even gladder to get rid of the sanctions. But you can't ask that question, so we don't know the numbers. But here, sanctions are over. They got rid of the tyrant. The United States can come in with enormous resources. I mean, just to give one amazing fact, they still have not reached the level of electricity of the pre-invasion period. I mean, my guess is that, you know, a couple of students from MIT could probably have put that grid together by now. But they have taken a situation which should have been an extremely easy military occupation and turned it into a total catastrophe. And in fact, what's happened is that the U.S. has backed off step by step from its initial aims. You read the press now, it sounds as if the U.S. wanted an election. That's just not true. The U.S. was opposed to elections. It tried in all sorts of ways to develop some kind of system which would prevent elections, a caucus system that they could control, some other trickery. And they had to back off. They had to back off on the privatization. Not totally, but Bremer's initial proposals, which are outlandish, they had to back off on. And in fact, if you think about it, I think it's a remarkable triumph of nonviolent resistance. I mean, it's not the guys throwing bombs that bother them that much. It's the steadfast refusal and resistance of the large majority of the population to accept these demands. It's an astonishing achievement. How it'll proceed, I don't know. I mean, with all the resources that they have, I assume that they can somehow manage to impose the plans that they now describe. We will force them to accept vague promises of eventual withdrawal and count on Tony Blair and George Bush's speechwriters to give the right the formulation of it.
It's going to be difficult, actually, for one simple reason, that I think most Iraqis just don't like being occupied by a foreign power.
Well, if you finish you didn't get the chance yet to read Blair's full interview.
No, he said it's not an occupation.
Not only that, he said he's furious about people who think it's an occupation, which happens to be about 99% of the population of Iraq by his own polls. You know.
Noam, if we move to another thorny question in the Middle East, which is that you don't just have the occupation of Iraq, you have the continuing occupation of Palestine by the Israelis. And on this question, it seems to me that public opinion in the West has almost given up, because the way it's presented, it's too complicated. When suicide bombers are presented, it's presented in the United States largely, but also in some parts of Western Europe, completely decontextualized. Arafat's death was sort of more or less celebrated in a vulgar fashion by large sections of the American media. A new person, Abu Mazen, has been elected, and now there are hopes that he will do what the Israelis want him to do. But he is not capable of doing that. He's not able to do that. Eric Hobsbawm, the English historian, said recently that if the Israelis carry on behaving in this fashion, the state of Israel as constituted at present might not exist by the end of the century. Now, who knows? But what do you think are the first 3-4 steps to a solution?
Well, I think they're pretty clear. And once again, actually, I actually did an article after the death of Arafat in which I went through the American media to see how it was treated. And it was horrendous. Amazing. But some of it was quite revealing, though. So, for example, the New York Times has an intelligent Middle East correspondent. He wrote a major think piece on the death of Arafat, front page story in the Times. It started by saying that the death of Arafat will offer a test for the quintessential faith of Americans that elections legitimize even the weakest systems. That's the first paragraph of the article on the front page. If you go on to the continuation page, to the last paragraph says the Americans would never accept elections before because they knew that Arafat was going to win. So that's the quintessential faith. You know, quintessential faith is elections are fine if they're going to come out the way we say. Yeah. Now, go to popular attitudes, which are extremely interesting and, as usual, suppressed. These same major public opinion agencies, and they do careful studies, found that, right now, in fact, about the percentage of Americans who think that the U.S. ought to tilt towards Israel is 17%. It's 17% of Americans think we should be more favorable to Israel. If you look at the in-depth studies, not reported, what they show is that a large majority, about 2/3, think that we should accept what's called here the Saudi plan, which is just the latest version of the two-state proposal that the U.S. has been blocking for 30 years. That's a large majority of the American population. Neither political party would even dream of it. Same large majority, roughly 2/3, think that the United States ought to cut off aid from either party, either Israel or the Palestinians, who are not negotiating in good faith on a two-state settlement. Well, that means cut off aid from Israel. Same majority says if both parties are negotiating, we ought to equalize aid to them. I mean, that is so radically different from anything in the political arena or any word you can read in the media that they don't know what to say about it. And what's interesting about all these numbers, including the ones I quoted before, is that these are opinions of people held in isolation. I mean, everyone who's answering those questions must think I'm the only person in the world who thinks this. They've certainly never seen it anywhere, never heard it anywhere. I mean, if it was possible to discuss these questions, if there was some functioning form of political democracy with organizations and discussions and debates and so on. Now, that would just reinforce the opinions. It would be much stronger. Well, that's a possible solution. In fact, it's on the table. In fact, as you know, it came pretty close. The Clinton Camp David proposals were totally impossible, and Clinton basically conceded that. A couple of months after Camp David 2000, he came out a couple of weeks before the end of his term with what were called the Clinton parameters, which were pretty vague, but much more forthcoming than the Camp David proposals, which were impossible. And that led to negotiations in Taba, Egypt, in January 2001. Clinton, when a couple of weeks after he announced his parameters, this is right at the end of the term, stated that, gave a speech in which he said that both sides Palestinians and Israelis have tentatively accepted his parameters, and both sides have reservations. Well, that's what was discussed at Taba. And the negotiators came to a conclusion that was not going to work as it stood, but was very close to the old international consensus the U.S. had been blocking. Well, Barak called off the negotiations. Then we get to a cycle of violence. But they continued. And there are now several versions. The best established one are the Geneva Accords, released in Geneva in December 2002, I think, 2002, which were supported by just about the entire world. The United States was the only major country that wouldn't even send a low-level delegate or make a comment about it. So they're dead. Well, they could be a basis for settlement. They're not perfect as they stand, but they're certainly a basis for settlement. And in fact, it's a possibility. It's been a possibility since the mid-'70s, and it remains a possibility if the United States will accept it. And the population overwhelmingly accepts it, but neither political party does. The media don't. There's no discussion possible about it. The degree of falsification about this is just mind-boggling. I mean, take, say, Tony Blair this morning. He's supposed to be the intelligent European.
He's a European.
You're prime minister. You're responsible for half European, maybe a quarter. But in his interview this morning, which is quite interesting, he says he's confident that within the next few weeks, the United States will, his good friend George Bush, will take the lead in taking the matter in hand and so on and so forth. But what's the problem that has to be taken in hand? Well, the problem is security for Israel, period. The Palestinians have to agree to ensure security for Israel. Not one word about what the major issue is. What about the occupation? What about the fact that the so-called Gaza withdrawal proposal is really a West Bank expansion proposal?
Exactly.
I mean, the same day that Sharon announced the Gaza withdrawal, his government also announced tens of millions of dollars of new construction in the occupied territories. Just a couple of days ago, they reported that secretly last summer, Israel had passed what was called in the New York Times a clarification of the absentee ownership law. The clarification allows Israel to confiscate without compensation lands of Palestinians living in what they call the seam, the area between the separation wall that they're building through the West Bank, between there and the border of Israel. Well, that means they can just take over more and more territory. It means somebody who's living in Bethlehem and whose olive groves are 10 yards away on the other side of the separation wall has lost ownership of them because he doesn't occupy that land. So therefore it gets confiscated. These programs of development, integration, infrastructure development, new settlement, and so on, that's what's undermining any political settlement. And the U.S. is supporting them, and Britain's keeping quiet about it.
I know,
and they go on all the time, and that's not considered a problem.
I mean, the notion that Israel, which has the fifth strongest army in the world, which has nuclear weapons, which has a stockpile of chemical weapons, could be threatened by any of the existing Arab states, leave alone the Palestinians, is just grotesque. I mean, they're trying to project the situation which did exist in 48 to what exists now, when they themselves became totally transformed and are the most threatening power in that region. And it always worries me, coming to the United States, that the media here, in particular, just is completely blind to Palestinian suffering. It doesn't exist.
But that's been true
for a long time.
Ever since the U.S. shifted policy.
Yeah.
I mean, that's basically 67. I mean, prior to that, the New York Times was not a pro-Israel newspaper. In fact, as you go back to the 1950s, the American Jewish Committee, its journal Commentary, was a non-Zionist journal. In fact, the Zionist organization actually set up a competing journal to express the Zionist point of view. Changed dramatically in 1967, and it finally changed in 1971. That's the crucial date there, which is effaced from American, not only media, but even most scholarship. In 1971, Egypt, Sadat, offered Israel a full peace treaty, right in terms of official U.S. policy. Jordan followed right along. The Israeli government discussed it, debated it, recognized that they could have peace and security and be integrated into the region and so on, but at the cost of giving up expansion. And expansion at that time meant primarily into the Sinai, where they were, this is the labor government, they were kicking out thousands of farmers and planning to build an all-Jewish city in the northeastern Sinai. That was the choice. Is it going to be expansion or peace? Well, they chose expansion. They rejected the offer. Crucial question was, what's the United States going to do? And there was an internal debate, and it was won by Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor. And his policy, as he describes, was stalemate. No negotiations, only force. Okay, that led to the 1973 war, very close call. Finally, in Camp David in 1978, the U.S. and Israel accepted Sadat's 1971 offer. That's called a triumph of American diplomacy. A total disaster. You know, the refusal to accept it led to a dangerous war, almost a nuclear confrontation. For Israel, it was a very close call. Enormous amount of suffering. Well, you know, by then they finally agreed, okay, they'll give back Egyptian territory, but by then they were expanding into the West Bank with U.S. funding and support over the opposition of the American population. And so it continues. But the solution to this problem is, you know, there are problems where it's hard to think of a solution. But here it's easy to think. It's not a pretty solution. It's, you know, I think it's a horrible solution, frankly, but it's a solution which would at least cut back the level of violence, would allow relations to establish, which might ultimately lead to something sane in the region. And it's sitting right there. All it requires is that the opinions of about 2/3 of Americans be taken into consideration.
We are approaching the end of this session. Lots of you have sent in questions, but reading the questions, we have covered many of the things you've asked. There's one question which we haven't discussed at all and haven't covered, and that's the one I'm going to pose to Noam. This is from a member of the audience. Who, in your opinion, is the most important anarchist thinker?
Well, any person I would mention is automatically disqualified, because any honest anarchist thinker would simply immediately reject the description of being the most important anarchist thinker. Actually, probably the most important anarchist thinkers, at least that I know of, are poor, illiterate peasants in Aragon and Catalonia in 1936, who actually constructed a successful live anarchist society over a large area, industrial and agricultural. Most of them were illiterate. They left documents. So there are some documents left which are extremely interesting. And it wasn't spontaneous. This had been after efforts that had been going on for 70 years, efforts that were attempts, crushed, try again, educational programs, all sorts of things. Finally, in the first year of the Spanish Revolution, it broke out and flourished. And it was so terrifying to everyone that every single power combined to crush it. The fascists, Russia, liberal democracies, put aside their differences to ensure that this would be crushed. And after they crushed it, they went, they fought the war as the War of Succession. Well, they were probably the most important anarchist thinkers. And the same's true everywhere. You take a look at the, say, IWW in the United States. I mean, those were important anarchist thinkers who actually carried out actions, which led finally to the development of the American labor movement, which had been bitterly suppressed. The U.S. has a very violent labor history. Actually, you know about it around here. But their activities and others like them finally did lead to substantial successes. There's major attacks against them since, but those are successes of people who are constructing worker-managed, community-run societies, which is kind of an anarchist ideal. And this is very deeply rooted in the United States. People forget what it's like. I mean, there was a period in American history in which there was substantial victories for democracy through the 19th century. It was called, people who write about it call it the period of self-rule. It was based on the assumption, which is very widespread in the United States, that wage labor is not very different from slavery. I mean, that was the slogan of Northern workers who fought in the Civil War. In fact, it was even the slogan of the Republican Party. It was, slavery is, of course, unacceptable, but so is wage slavery. You have to control your own fate. You read the newspapers written during the period of the freest press in the United States, the late 19th century, where working people were running their own newspapers, communities, and others. People in the mills in eastern Massachusetts, origins of the American Industrial Revolution, their press is what we would call anarchist. These are, Irish artisans from the slums of Boston, farm girls from what they called factory girls, young women coming off the farms into the mills. They just took for granted that those who work in the mills should own them, and that we should we should create our own self-managed society, integrating with others. That's a deep part of American history. It takes a lot of effort to crush it.
On that utopian note, I think we've come to the end of the evening. Thank you all very much, and thank you, Mo.